The fox warned the wolves of the coming fire. Next morning, the alpha left food at his den. The fox ran through smoke that hadn't yet formed, through air that already tasted of ash and ending. His paws struck the forest floor in rhythms of panic, each stride a decision between self-preservation and something older than survival, something that lived in the blood memory of prey, calling out to predator, of the hunted breaking every law of nature to warn the hunter. Behind him, miles south where the wind gathered its breath, the first orange teeth of wildfire bit into dry timber. Before him, in the granite den complex near the river's bend, the wolf pack slept in the cool shadows of late summer, unaware that the wind had changed, that death was traveling north faster than any four-legged thing could run. The fox stopped at the territorial boundary marked by wolf scent and urine, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. Yet he opened his mouth and released a sound that was neither bark nor scream, a warning that tore from his throat like prophecy, high and desperate and completely impossibly wrong for a creature of his kind to make in this place, at this hour, in the presence of those who had taken everything from him. Wait, before the next revelation happens. If this bond between these creatures has already touched you, tell us where you're watching from. To witness every act of courage, every impossible friendship, and every silent miracle of nature, subscribe and join our circle. The next moment will change everything. Now, back to the wild. Part 1. The Incident and the Proposition. 3 weeks before the fire, before the fox learned the weight of debt and the algebra of mercy, the wolves had come for his family. It happened during the velvet hours of twilight, when the forest breathed differently, when shadows lengthened into passages between the living world and something more ancient. The fox, who had no name because foxes don't carry such things, only sense and memories and the sharp knowledge of their own mortality, had been hunting voles in the meadow's eastern edge when he heard his mate's warning cry cut short. He ran towards silence, which is always worse than sound. By the time he reached their den, the earth around the entrance was torn and dark with disturbance. The pack had been efficient. There were no bodies. Wolves rarely left evidence of their economy. Only scent remained, the acrid musk of predator, the copper trace of terror, and underneath it all, the absence of his mate's familiar smell, his kit's milk-sweet breath. The den mouth gaped empty, a throat that had swallowed his entire world. The fox stood there as night completed its claim on the day. He did not howl. Foxes don't mourn like wolves, with grand proclamations to the sky. Instead, he performed the small, precise autopsy of loss, sniffing each disturbed stone, reading the scattered earth like a hunter reads tracks, understanding through scent and sign exactly what had happened and why. The pack had been hungry. The deer had moved to higher ground that summer, following rain that fell elsewhere. A nursing vixen and 3 kits were opportunity, not cruelty. This was the mathematics of survival, ancient and indifferent as stone. But understanding didn't dull the blade of absence. For 3 weeks, the fox became a ghost in his own territory. He hunted mechanically, ate without tasting, slept in shallow shifts beneath thornbush and fallen timber, never in the den, which he couldn't bear to enter and couldn't bear to leave. He tracked the wolf pack obsessively, learning their patterns, their preferences, their hierarchy written in the way they moved through the forest. There were 7 of them, the alpha pair, 3 younger adults, and 2 adolescents from the previous year's litter. The alpha male was large for a timber wolf, his coat the color of smoke and ash, one ear torn from some old battle. The female was smaller, quicker, with eyes like amber stones and a scar across her muzzle. They denned in the granite outcropping where the river bent east, a fortress of stone that had sheltered wolves for generations. The fox watched them with an intensity that felt like prayer or madness or both. He learned that the alpha female favored the youngest adolescent, often bringing him choice portions. He learned that the alpha male tested the air every morning with a particular tilt of his head, reading the wind like prophecy. He learned their vulnerabilities, their rhythms, their small kindnesses to each other. He learned to hate them with a purity that was almost love. On the day the wind changed, the fox was sleeping in a crevice 2 miles south of the wolf den. He woke to wrongness. The air tasted different, sharp and heated, carrying the ghost scent of combustion, still miles distant but approaching with mathematical certainty. He climbed from his shelter and stood on a granite shelf, nose working the breeze. Fire. Coming from the south where the drought had turned the forest into kindling, moving fast through the understory, pushed by winds that had been building for 3 days. The fox calculated distances, wind speed, the time it would take for flame to reach different parts of the territory. In his mind, he mapped the forest and understood. The river bend where the wolves denned would be directly in the fire's path by mid-morning. The granite would offer no protection from smoke. The young ones would die first, their lungs still learning the work of breathing. The pack would realize too late that their fortress had become a tomb. The fox stood very still. In his chest, something fought with something else, the bright arithmetic of revenge against an older law he couldn't name. He could nothing. He could return to his den, gather what remained of his scattered life, move north ahead of the flames. By tomorrow, the wolves would be gone. The debt of his mate and kits would be settled by fire, that most ancient and impartial judge. He could let them die. He started walking south, away from the wolves. Made it 30 paces before his legs stopped working. His body knew something his rage hadn't learned yet, that the weight of carrying death through inaction was heavier than the weight of loss itself, that revenge was a coin that bought nothing, changed nothing, returned nothing, that the wolves had killed his family not from malice, but from the same hunger that drove him to hunt voles, the same need that governed every breathing thing. And beneath all of this, deeper than thought, was the truth that lived in his blood and bone. They were all citizens of the same kingdom. The forest was not a collection of solitary tragedies, but a web. And what befell the wolves befell him, befell everything. The fire would not stop at the wolf den. It would consume the vole tunnels, the deer trails, the berry thickets where his mate had taught their kits to forage. It would rewrite the entire territory, and those who survived would inherit an ash world where old grudges meant nothing. The fox turned north. He ran through the pre-dawn darkness, covering the 2 miles to the wolf den in rhythms of panic and purpose. The smoke was still distant, but he could feel it in the air's texture, could taste the future in every breath. As he approached the territorial boundary, marked by scent posts and urine signatures, every survival instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn back, to honor the invisible treaties that kept prey separate from predator. He crossed the boundary. And he called out, his voice high and strange, a warning that no fox should ever give in such a place. The sound tore from his throat, part alarm bark, part scream, pure urgency translated into sound. He called again and again, breaking every rule of stealth that had kept his kind alive for millennia. From the den complex, silence. Then, movement. The alpha male emerged from shadow into the gray light before dawn, massive and sudden as an avalanche. his lips peeled back from teeth made for tearing, his shoulders bunching with the promise of violence. Behind him, the rest of the pack materialized like smoke given form. The fox stood his ground, which was another impossible thing. Everything in his body demanded flight, but he held his position at the boundary, calling out his warning in that high, desperate voice. The alpha male stalked closer, head low, each step a question the fox couldn't answer with words. So he turned, looked deliberately south, let his entire body speak the language of alarm, ears flat, tail low, every muscle rigid with urgency. He barked again, then ran 10 paces south before stopping, looking back at the wolves. The universal gesture, "Follow me, danger comes, we must move." The alpha male stopped, his head lifted, testing the air with that particular tilt the fox had observed so many times. The big wolf went very still, and in that stillness, the fox saw the exact moment when the alpha smelled it too. Smoke, still distant, but carried on wind that spoke of catastrophe approaching. The pack stirred, nervous energy rippling through them. The alpha female emerged fully from the den, her amber eyes moving from the fox to her mate to the southern horizon where the sky was just beginning to show the wrong kind of dawn, orange and bruised and utterly merciless. For a long moment, the wolves and the fox existed in the same pocket of time, suspended between the world that had been and the world that was coming. The alpha male looked at the fox with an expression that held no warmth, but perhaps something like recognition, the acknowledgement of one survival mind witnessing another, the calculus of threat and truth being rapidly performed. The alpha turned to his pack and made a low sound, commanding and urgent. The wolves began to move, gathering the adolescents, rousing the yearlings from sleep. The alpha female disappeared into the den and emerged with one of the pups by the scruff, her mate following with another. The pack assembled with the swift efficiency of those who understood that discussion was a luxury they couldn't afford. They ran north, not fleeing in panic, but moving with purpose, the alpha male leading, the female bringing up the rear with the slowest pups. They passed within 10 feet of where the fox stood, and not one of them broke stride to attack him. It wasn't mercy, it was priorities. The fire didn't care about old grudges or the food chain. It would take them all equally if they didn't move. The fox ran with them at first, maintaining distance but keeping pace. They moved through the forest as the sky behind them brightened into apocalypse, the smoke beginning to paint the air, the birds fleeing overhead in confused flocks. After a mile, the fox peeled away, angling northwest while the wolves continued due north toward the high country where the river ran wide and the granite shelves could serve as fire breaks. He found his own refuge in a system of caves he'd discovered while tracking them weeks before, a warren of stone above the timberline where smoke might pass but flame couldn't reach. As he settled into the darkness, his body finally allowed him to shake, not with fear, but with the aftermath of adrenaline and the strangeness of what he'd done. He'd saved them, the creatures who had destroyed his family. He'd run into their territory, warned them, and given them the gift of time. He didn't know why. Or perhaps he did, and the knowing was too large to fit into thought, residing instead in the wordless place where instinct and something older than instinct lived together, the place that understood the forest was a conversation, not a monologue, and that survival was sometimes larger than revenge. The fox slept in that stone darkness while the fire remade the world below. Part 2. The Labyrinth of Instinct. The forest burned for 3 days and 2 nights, rewriting the territory in flame script, reducing the familiar to ash and memory. From his refuge in the caves, the fox watched smoke paint the sky in shades of ending. The sound was worst at night, A roar like wind, but underneath it, the sharp cracks of timber giving way, the occasional boom of sap-heavy trees exploding from internal pressure. The fire spoke in a language older than teeth or claw, reminding everything that breathed that they were all tenants, never owners, of the earth they walked. When it finally passed, driven east by shifting winds and exhausted of fuel, the fox descended to see what remained. The forest had become a study in black and gray. The ground cover was gone entirely, reduced to ash that rose in small ghosts with each step. The trees that still stood were charcoal monuments, their bark peeled away, their branches reaching skyward like the hands of supplicants who had prayed to the wrong god. Some still smoldered, small orange eyes winking in the devastation. The air tasted of ending and char, and beneath it all, the sweet, sick smell of animals that hadn't run fast enough. The fox moved through this transformed world carefully, testing each step. The earth was still warm, radiating heat through the pads of his paws. His den was gone, not destroyed so much as erased. The entrance collapsed, the surrounding territory scorched into anonymity. He felt no grief at this. The den had been empty of everything that mattered long before the fire came. He traveled north, following the path the wolves had taken, reading the landscape for signs of what survived. The river still ran, though its banks were black and sterile. Some of the granite outcroppings had sheltered small pockets of green, ferns and moss that had escaped the flames' hunger. These would be the seeds of recovery, the places where the forest would remember what it had been and begin again. Near midday, he found the first sign. A deer carcass, freshly killed, the meat already being worked by ravens. The kill was too clean, too efficient to be anything but wolf work. They had survived then, and they were hunting. The fox kept moving, following instinct and the faint traces of scent that the smoke-saturated air almost completely masked. He found them at the northern edge of what had been their territory, in a valley where the fire had burned less intensely, leaving scattered stands of damaged but living timber. The pack had claimed a shallow cave system in a hillside, temporary shelter while they assessed the changed world. The fox observed from a distance, hidden in the skeleton of a burned-out thorn bush. The wolves looked diminished by catastrophe, but intact. All 7 had survived, including the pups, though they moved with the wariness of those who had witnessed their world unmade. The alpha male was directing the pack's movements with small gestures and low vocalizations, where to rest, when to hunt, who would watch the young ones. The fox watched them for hours, until the light began to fail and the pack settled for the night. He didn't know what he was doing here, why he'd tracked them, instead of moving on to claim new territory, untouched by fire or memory. But something kept him in place, observing, bearing witness to their survival he had enabled. As darkness completed its claim, he turned to leave, and stopped. The alpha male stood 30 feet away, perfectly still, watching him. In the failing light, the big wolf was more shadow than substance, but his eyes caught what remained of the day and held it, 2 points of amber regard. They looked at each other across the distance, predator and prey locked in a moment that had no name, no precedent in the long history of their kinds. The alpha didn't approach, didn't threaten, simply stood there, acknowledging the fox's presence with the weight of his gaze. Then he turned and disappeared into the gathering dark, leaving the fox alone with the question of what that look had meant: recognition, curiosity, warning, or perhaps something else entirely. Something without a word, because words were a human luxury, and they were dealing in the older currencies of scent and sight and the unspoken agreements that governed life in the wild. The fox left, But he didn't go far. He denned that night in a crevice a quarter-mile from the wolf pack's temporary shelter, close enough to hear them if they howled, far enough to maintain the fiction of separation that their respective species required. The pattern repeated over the following days. The fox hunted in the scorched landscape, finding voles and mice that had survived in underground burrows, scavenging from deer and elk that had perished in the fire. He ate what he needed and cached the rest. And he watched the wolves, drawn by an obsession he couldn't name or dismiss. He learned their new patterns. The pack was struggling. The fire had pushed most of the large prey north and east out of what remained of the wolves' traditional hunting grounds. The alpha pair led hunts that often came back empty, and the two pups, nearly weaned but still dependent, were beginning to show the angular sharpness of insufficient food. On the fourth morning after the fire, the fox killed a rabbit, one of the few he'd found, probably driven into the burned territory by hunger of its own. It was a good kill, clean and quick. The rabbit was fat, well-fed from somewhere the fire hadn't reached, more meat than the fox needed for himself. He carried it toward the wolf den, stopping at the boundary he'd established in his own mind, the invisible line beyond which he refused to cross unless urgency demanded. He left the rabbit there, in plain sight on a flat stone, and retreated to watch. An hour later, one of the younger wolves found it. She sniffed it suspiciously, checking for poison or trap, then carried it back to the den. The fox saw the alpha male emerge, examine the rabbit, and then do something unexpected. The big wolf turned and looked directly at the hiding place where the fox had concealed himself, as if he'd known all along exactly where the observer was positioned. Their eyes met. The alpha male tilted his head slightly, that gesture the fox had seen him use when testing the wind, reading the world's invisible messages. Then the wolf took the rabbit into the den to feed the pups and the nursing female. The next morning, the fox found a response. He approached his usual observation point to discover a portion of deer haunch positioned on the same flat stone where he'd left the rabbit. The meat was fresh, the cut made with canine efficiency. It sat there like punctuation in a conversation the fox didn't know they were having. He approached cautiously, testing the air for ambush, for the scent of wolves lying in wait. But there was only the meat, left deliberately, unmistakably a gift. Or perhaps a question, or perhaps an answer to a question he'd asked without knowing. The fox fed. The meat was good, rich with the fat that late summer deer carried. As he ate, the alpha male emerged from the tree line 50 yards distant. The wolf didn't approach, didn't threaten. He simply stood there, watching the fox consume the offering, his expression inscrutable. When the fox finished and looked up, the wolf was gone. So began a dialogue conducted in the grammar of survival. Food left and received, presence acknowledged, distance maintained. Every few days, the fox would leave something at the boundary stone, a rabbit, a brace of voles, once a fish had caught in the recovering stream. And the wolves, in their turn, would reciprocate with portions of their larger kills, venison, elk, once the leg of a young moose. The pack began to rebuild. The pups fattened. The adults ranged farther, reclaiming territory and re-establishing the boundaries that the fire had erased. And through it all, the fox remained a presence at the edge of their world, neither pack member nor enemy, existing in a category that had no precedent, no name. The other wolves noticed, of course. The alpha female watched him with particular intensity, her amber eyes tracking his movements whenever he appeared. The younger wolves showed curiosity mixed with uncertainty, occasionally approaching closer than their elders would have permitted under normal circumstances before some signal from the alphas would call them back. But it was the alpha male who understood, who recognized in the fox's persistent presence something more complex than gratitude or obligation. The big wolf would sometimes sit at the boundary, in the early morning or at dusk, and simply exist in the fox's vicinity. Not friendly, not hostile, but acknowledging the strange treaty they had negotiated without words. One evening, as autumn began to paint the recovering forest in shades of amber and rust, the fox was drinking from the stream when he became aware of being watched. He looked up to see the alpha male on the opposite bank, close enough that the fox could see the individual hairs of his ruff moving in the breeze, the small scars that mapped his history across his muzzle and shoulders. They regarded each other across the water. The fox should have run. Every instinct bred into him over countless generations demanded flight. But he held his ground, returning the wolf's gaze with something like equilibrium. The alpha male made a sound, low and complex, neither growl nor greeting, but somewhere in between. A vocalization that seemed to acknowledge the strangeness of their situation, the impossibility of what they'd become to each other. Then the wolf turned and loped back toward his pack, powerful and purposeful and entirely himself. The fox stood at the water's edge long after the wolf had gone, watching the stream carry away the reflection of a sky that was slowly healing from smoke and ash, returning to the clear blue of autumn. He thought of his mate, his kits, the den that would never be home again. He thought of the choice he'd made at the boundary, the warning he'd given when revenge would have been easier, cleaner, more satisfying in its simplicity. He didn't regret it. Couldn't, even though the absence in his heart hadn't diminished. Because what he'd found in the aftermath of that choice was something he hadn't expected. Not friendship exactly, not forgiveness, but perhaps a kind of understanding that ran deeper than either. A recognition that they were all, fox and wolf, prey and predator, walking the same paths through a world that didn't care about their individual stories, only whether they survived long enough to tell them. The forest was beginning to remember itself. Green shoots pushed through the ash. Birds returned, testing the scorched timber for nesting sites. The voles proliferated in the absence of competition, and the predators who fed on them followed in turn. Life, relentless and indifferent, reclaimed what fire had taken. And at the center of this slow recovery, a fox and a wolf pack maintained their impossible conversation, speaking in the language of survival and the grammar of respect, writing a story that no one was there to witness or record, a story that existed only in the daily exchanges at the boundary stone, in the shared understanding of what the fire had taught them, in the strange peace they'd negotiated in the aftermath of loss. Part 3. The Revelation and the Fracture. The trapper came with the first hard freeze of autumn, when the recovering forest was just beginning to believe in its own future. The fox smelled him before seeing him, human scent carried on the north wind, mixed with steel and canvas and the particular chemical smell of modern human things. He was moving through what remained of the burned territory, following the game trails that were re-establishing themselves, setting his equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood animal behavior and how to exploit it. The fox tracked him carefully, staying downwind, observing from distance and cover. The human was older, weathered like the landscape, moving through the forest with a confidence that spoke of long familiarity. He placed his traps near the stream, in the thickets where rabbits shelter, along the deer trails where predators traveled. Steel-jawed devices that would close with mechanical certainty on any paw or leg that triggered them. This was danger of a kind the fire hadn't been. Targeted, intelligent, patient. The fire had been indiscriminate apocalypse. The trapper was surgical precision, selecting for the most successful hunters, the boldest scavengers, the animals who had survived everything else only to be caught by their own competence. The fox watched him for 3 days, mapping the placement of each trap, learning the pattern of the human's routes. On the 4th day, he made a decision that should have been simple, but wasn't. Move east, beyond the burned territory. Find new ground where steel jaws didn't wait in the grass. But before he left, He visited the boundary stone one final time. The wolves needed to know. They ranged widely now, hunting across all the territory they'd reclaimed. Sooner or later, one of them would step wrong, trigger wrong, bleed out in the grass while the trapper checked his lines. The fox left his scent at the stone, stronger than usual, mixing it with the urgency pheromones that his kind used to signal alarm. It was a crude message, without the specificity he needed, but it was all the language they shared. Then he moved east, to where the forest still stood untouched, to begin again in a place where the past couldn't follow. He made it half a mile before he heard it, a scream that split the afternoon quiet, high and sharp and absolutely wrong. Not wolf, not quite. One of the adolescents, the male the alpha female favored, his voice stretched into agony that spoke of steel teeth and held limbs and panic so pure it transcended species. The fox ran toward the sound, every survival instinct howling at him to do the opposite, to flee, to save himself. He found the young wolf near the stream, his right front leg caught in one of the traps, the steel jaws buried deep in fur and flesh. The adolescent was thrashing, making the injury worse with each panicked movement, his eyes rolling white with terror and pain. The trap was chained to a stake driven deep into the earth. The wolf pulled against it uselessly, each lunge sending fresh blood down his leg to paint the frost-bright grass. The fox approached slowly, his presence finally cutting through the young wolf's panic. The adolescent froze, staring at him with an expression that held both fear and something like pleading, the universal language of suffering begging for relief. The fox circled the trap, examining it with the careful attention he'd learned from watching the trapper. It was designed to hold, not kill outright. The jaws were closed with pressure that wouldn't release from pulling. There was a mechanism, a trigger plate the human would use to open it when checking his lines. The fox nosed at the trap, and the young wolf whined, a sound no wolf should make, especially not to a fox. But pain and fear had stripped away the predator and prey, leaving only two animals in distress, one caught and one trying to understand the geometry of human cruelty. The mechanism was too complex for paws, even clever ones. The fox couldn't open it, couldn't free the wolf no matter how carefully he worked at the steel. And the light was failing, and the human would check his traps in the morning. And this young wolf who had survived the fire would die anyway, either from the trapper's club or from the slower death of shock and exposure when the temperature dropped after dark. The fox stopped trying, looked at the young wolf who had quieted now, his breathing ragged but his eyes focused, watching the fox with an intensity that felt like prayer or judgment or both. Then the fox ran. Not away, but toward the den, moving faster than he'd ever moved, the distance collapsing beneath his paws like water. He reached the boundary and didn't stop, didn't slow, crashed through it into the wolf's territory proper, barking that same high alarm call he'd used the morning of the fire. The alpha male appeared first, his hackles rising at the sight of the fox so far into their ground. But the fox didn't retreat. He barked again, turned, ran 10 paces back the way he'd come, looked back. The same gesture he'd used before. Follow me, danger comes, your pack needs you. The alpha male understood immediately. He howled once, a rallying cry that brought the pack from shelter and rest. Within seconds they were running, following the fox as he led them toward the stream, toward the place where one of their own was held by steel and human intention. They reached the young wolf as full darkness fell. The adolescent was weaker now, shivering with shock, his leg a mess of blood and torn tissue. The alpha male went to him immediately, touching his muzzle to the youngster's head, making low sounds of comfort and assessment. The alpha female examined the trap, her amber eyes reflecting the last light as she worked to understand what the fox had already learned. This was beyond their capacity to fix. The steel didn't care about teeth or strength. It simply held, patient and merciless as winter. The pack gathered around their fallen member, and the fox watched from a small distance, witnessing their helplessness transform into something like rage. The alpha male tried to dig out the stake, but it was buried too deep, angled into the earth with professional expertise. Two of the younger adults tried to work the mechanism with their teeth, succeeding only in cutting their mouths on the metal. As the temperature dropped and the stars emerged cold and indifferent overhead, the alpha male made a decision. He turned from the trapped adolescent and looked directly at the fox. The big wolf's eyes held a question, or perhaps a demand, or perhaps simply the acknowledgement that the fox had brought them here, and therefore might know something they didn't. The fox didn't know anything. He had no solution, no clever plan, no way to defeat the human's trap. He'd brought them here because leaving one of their own to suffer alone felt worse than failing together, though he couldn't have explained that logic even to himself. The pack bedded down around the trapped wolf, their bodies creating a barrier of warmth against the killing cold. The young wolf had stopped struggling, his breathing shallow, his eyes glazing with the particular distance that prey animals wear when the end approaches. The alpha female licked his wounds, cleaning them with the gentle precision of a mother, though they all knew cleaning wouldn't save him. The fox remained at the edge of their circle, neither excluded nor welcomed, simply present. As the night deepened and the cold grew teeth, he moved closer, adding his smaller warmth to theirs, curling near the trapped wolf's hindquarters where his body heat might do some small good. No one objected. In the extremity of the moment, the old boundaries had dissolved. They were just animals, trying to keep one of their own alive through the dark hours, hoping for a morning that might bring miracle or at least mercy. The human came at dawn. The fox smelled him first, that particular scent cutting through the frost-sharpened air. He chittered a warning, and the pack stirred, rising to face the approaching presence. The alpha male positioned himself between the trapper and the injured adolescent, his body language pure threat, his lips peeled back from teeth that had ended the lives of deer and elk and anything else that had made the mistake of being prey. The human stopped 30 feet away. He was carrying a rifle, the metal catching the weak morning light. His eyes moved across the scene before him, the trapped wolf, the pack arrayed in defense, and the fox, impossibly present among them. The man's face registered surprise, then calculation, then something that might have been respect or might have been regret. He raised the rifle, and the alpha male gathered himself to charge, though they both knew how that would end, with the wolf dead in the grass, another pelt for the human's collection. The shot never came. Instead, the human lowered the rifle and spoke, his voice carrying across the frozen distance. The words were meaningless sounds to the fox, but the tone was clear enough, something like apology, something like acknowledgement. The man approached slowly, the rifle held non-threateningly, his movements deliberate and unaggressive. The pack tensed, but held position, reading in the human's body language the same thing the fox read, not immediate threat, but caution required. The man knelt beside the trap, keeping his eyes averted from the wolves in the universal gesture of non-confrontation. He triggered the mechanism with practiced hands, and the steel jaws opened with a snap that sounded like broken promises. The young wolf yelped as blood rushed back into the damaged limb. The alpha female was there immediately, supporting him as he struggled upright on 3 legs, the fourth hanging useless and torn. The pack closed around him protectively, and the human stepped back, giving them space, his face showing something complex, perhaps shame at what his trap had done, perhaps amazement at what he was witnessing. The alpha male turned to look at the human, then at the fox, then back to the human. In that moment, three species shared an understanding that transcended language. They were all trying to survive in a world that kept getting harder, kept demanding more than seemed reasonable to give. The human with his traps and rifle, the wolves with their pack bonds and hunting skill, the fox with his solitary cleverness and impossible choices. The human gathered his trap and left, moving quickly, glancing back once before disappearing into the frost-bright morning. He didn't reset the trap, didn't check the others, simply left, as if what he'd witnessed had changed some equation in his head, rewritten some internal map of what mattered and what didn't. The pack moved slowly back toward their den, the injured adolescent supported between two adults, his whimpers of pain cutting the morning quiet. The fox followed at a distance, maintaining the separation that felt necessary even after spending the night in their midst. But as they neared the den, the alpha male stopped and turned. He looked at the fox for a long moment, and this time there was something different in that amber gaze, not just recognition or respect, but a weight of debt acknowledged, a complexity of feeling that had no name, because wolves didn't name their feelings, only lived them. The big wolf made a low sound in his chest, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something entirely other. Then he turned and disappeared into the den complex, leaving the fox alone with the morning and the memory of a night spent breaking every rule that had kept his kind alive for millennia. The young wolf survived, though his leg healed crooked and he walked with a limp that would mark him for the rest of his days. The trapper never returned to that section of forest, though whether from superstition or conscience, the fox would never know. And the fox, who had come to deliver a warning and ended up witnessing the messy complexity of mercy, found he couldn't leave after all. The boundaries had shifted in the night he'd spent curled near a dying wolf, surrounded by predators who should have torn him apart, but didn't. He'd crossed some invisible line into territory that had no map, no precedent, no guide, except the strange pull of connection that defied every sensible instinct. He stayed, not close, never that, but present, a small red shadow at the edge of the wolves' world, writing a story that no one was there to read except those who lived it. Part 4. The Return and the Trial. Winter came to the recovering forest like an examination, testing everything the fire had left behind. Snow fell in late November, covering the ash and scorch marks, giving the landscape a temporary forgiveness. The burned timber stood in stark contrast to the right ground, black bones reaching through winter's shroud. But the smaller plants and grasses lay dormant beneath the snow, waiting for spring to prove whether they had survived or merely postponed their dying. The fox had denned in a hollow log a quarter-mile from the wolf pack's territory, close enough to maintain the strange relationship they'd negotiated, far enough to preserve the fiction that he was still a solitary hunter, independent and self-sufficient. He hunted the winter landscape efficiently, his red coat stark against the snow, making no attempt at stealth because the world was too white and open for hiding. Instead, he relied on speed and the knowledge of where voles tunneled beneath the snow, where rabbits sheltered in the remaining thickets. He left offerings at the boundary stone when he made exceptional kills, a fat rabbit here, a pair of ptarmigan there, and the wolves reciprocated with portions of their larger hunts. The injured adolescent had recovered enough to travel with the pack, though his limp meant he couldn't keep pace during the long chases. The alpha female had begun teaching him different hunting strategies, techniques that relied on ambush rather than pursuit, adapting his role within the pack to match his new limitations. The fox watched these adjustments with interest, recognizing in the pack's flexibility something that mirrored his own adaptability. Survival wasn't about being the strongest or fastest. It was about being able to change when circumstances demanded it, about learning new patterns when old ones failed. In late December, a storm moved in from the north, the kind of weather event that arrived with warnings written in the air's pressure, the birds' nervous flight patterns, the particular quality of light that spoke of atmospheric violence approaching. The fox felt it in his bones and fur, that deep animal knowledge that a blizzard was coming, the kind that closed the world down to nothing but wind and white and the fight to keep breathing. He moved to his den and waited as the storm descended. It lasted 3 days, howling across the landscape with a fury that felt personal, dumping snow until the familiar landmarks disappeared beneath undifferentiated white. The fox stayed curled in his hollow log, conserving heat and energy, sleeping through most of it, emerging only when the wind briefly calmed to dig out his entrance and make yellow marks in the snow to reclaim his small territory from the storm's erasure. On the 4th day, the wind stopped. The silence was profound, almost painful after the days of constant noise. The fox emerged into a transformed world. The snow was chest-deep in places, sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind, covering everything in pristine white that hurt to look at in the bright sunlight. He began the work of hunting, which was exponentially harder now. The vole tunnels were buried too deep to hear or smell. The rabbits had burrowed into shelters he couldn't reach. He traveled farther than usual, burning energy to find food, the mathematics of winter survival growing more desperate with each empty hour. On the 5th day after the storm, weak with hunger and growing colder despite his winter coat, the fox approached the boundary stone. There was nothing there. The wolves were struggling too, he knew, the deer and elk having moved to lower elevations where browse was still accessible. He left his scent anyway, a small gesture of presence, then turned to leave. He heard the sound before he saw the source, a high, distressed whining coming from the direction of the wolf den. Not the deep howls of adult wolves, but the higher-pitched cries of the pups, older now, nearly adolescent themselves, but still young enough that their voices carried the frequency of desperate need. The fox moved toward the sound, fighting through snow that sometimes came up to his shoulders, arriving at a vantage point where he could observe the den complex without exposing himself fully. What he saw stopped him completely. The alpha male was down. The big wolf lay in the snow outside the den entrance, his breathing labored and ragged, his left hind leg twisted at an angle that spoke of fracture or worse. The alpha female stood over him, her amber eyes wild with something the fox had never seen in them before: fear. The rest of the pack milled nearby, their body language uncertain, the hierarchy suddenly unstable with their leader injured. The fox pieced together what must have happened. A hunt gone wrong, probably a desperate attempt to bring down an elk or deer, the alpha male taking a kick or falling on ice hidden beneath the snow. The kind of injury that would be serious in summer and potentially fatal in winter, when mobility meant the difference between eating and starving, between warmth and freezing. As he watched, one of the younger wolves approached the alpha male with a portion of meat, something small, probably a rabbit one of them had caught. The big wolf tried to eat but couldn't rise enough to feed properly. The meat fell from his jaws back into the snow, and the attempt left him panting with exhaustion and pain. The pups were crying because they understood, in the way that young animals do, that something fundamental had shifted. The pack's anchor was failing, and winter didn't care about loyalty or hierarchy or the bonds that held them together. Winter only cared about the mathematics of calories and warmth, and an injured alpha male was a liability they couldn't afford. The fox should have left. This wasn't his pack, wasn't his problem, wasn't his responsibility. He'd already done more than any fox should, more than made sense, more than repaid whatever debt the morning of the fire had created. He'd warned them, helped them, existed in their orbit with a patience that defied instinct. But as he watched the alpha female try to rally the pack, try to organize a hunt when half her attention was on her injured mate, try to hold together a structure that was fracturing under the weight of winter and bad luck, the fox understood something. The debt wasn't paid, would never be paid, because what had grown between them wasn't about accounts balanced or favors returned. It was something stranger and more durable, something that had roots in the morning he'd crossed the boundary to warn them, and had grown through every exchange at the boundary stone, every shared moment of crisis, every impossible choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. The fox left his observation point and ran, not away, but with purpose, moving through the snow with the efficiency of desperation. He knew these woods better than the wolves did now, knew where the game was hiding, where the winter-killed deer might be lying beneath the snow, where the rabbits burrowed in the lee of the few standing structures the fire had left. He hunted with intensity that burned through his remaining energy reserves, found a rabbit warren, dug through snow and frozen earth with paws that bled from the effort, caught one and then another, cached them and kept hunting. Found a deer that had died during the storm, frozen solid but still meat, tore at it until he'd freed a portion he could carry, moved in expanding circles, hunting, caching, returning, hunting again. By nightfall, he'd assembled a collection of food near the boundary stone, 3 rabbits, a portion of deer haunch, 2 grouse he'd caught roosting in the snow-laden branches. It wasn't enough to save the pack through winter, but it was enough for a few days, enough to give them time to adjust, to reorganize, to figure out how to survive with their alpha male injured. He left it there and retreated to watch. The alpha female found it at dusk, her nose working the air as she approached cautiously, checking for trap or trick. When she recognized the fox's scent mixed with the prey scent, she went very still. She looked toward where he was hiding, though he didn't think she could actually see him in the failing light. Her expression was complex, gratitude mixed with something like wonder, the acknowledgement of receiving help from the most unlikely source. She took the food back to the pack, multiple trips, carrying what she could and then returning for more. The fox watched as they fed, as the pup's cries quieted, as even the injured alpha male managed to eat a little, the meat brought directly to him by his mate, torn into pieces small enough to manage. The next day, the fox hunted again, and the day after that. A pattern emerged. He would hunt with methodical efficiency, bringing what he caught to the boundary stone, and the wolves would collect it, the alpha female always pausing to scent the air in the direction of his hiding places, always acknowledging his presence even when she couldn't see him. The injured alpha male began to recover slowly. The leg wasn't broken, they discovered, only badly bruised and sprained. With rest and food, the swelling went down, the pain lessened, mobility began to return. It took 2 weeks before the big wolf could walk without limping, 3 before he could run, 4 before he was hunting with the pack again. During those weeks, the fox became something he'd never been, a provider for wolves. It violated every natural law, every instinct, every reasonable behavior pattern for his species. But he did it anyway, driven by something he couldn't name, not debt, not friendship exactly, but perhaps a kind of belonging that transcended the categories of predator and prey, pack and solitary, wolf and fox. On the day the alpha male returned to full strength, leading a successful hunt on a weakened elk, the pack brought the entire carcass to the boundary stone. Not a portion, not a token. The whole kill, more meat than the fox could ever eat, enough to last him weeks if he could preserve it in the snow. The alpha male himself brought the last portion, dragging it to the stone and then sitting back, waiting. The fox emerged from hiding, cautiously approaching the offering. The big wolf watched him with those amber eyes, and in them was something the fox had never seen before, not just recognition or respect, but equality. The acknowledgement that they had saved each other, had provided for each other, had created between them something that had no precedent but was real nonetheless. The wolf stood and walked toward the fox, closing the distance between them in slow, deliberate steps. Every survival instinct screamed at the fox to run, but he held his ground, meeting the wolf's approach with a stillness that felt like trust or madness or both. The alpha male stopped 5 feet away. He lowered his massive head, that gesture of non-aggression that canids used across species and centuries. Then he turned and walked back toward his pack, leaving the fox standing at the boundary stone with enough food to last the rest of winter and the understanding that something fundamental had changed. They weren't pack, would never be that. The fox was too solitary, too different, too bound by the patterns of his own kind. But they were something. Allies, perhaps, or partners in the ongoing negotiation with a world that kept testing their capacity to adapt and survive and find new ways of being when old ways failed. Winter continued its examination of the forest, but the fox and the wolf pack faced it together, in their separate ways, connected by the invisible threads of choices made and gifts given, and the strange peace that came from understanding they were all just trying to make it through to spring. Part 5. The Resolution and Renewal. Spring arrived late that year, testing the forest's faith in seasons, in cycles, in the promise that what died would return. The snow lingered into early April, reluctant to release its grip, but finally gave way to the urgent green of new growth. The burned timber that had survived the fire began to show signs of recovery. Small shoots emerging from blackened bark, proof that life could persist even in wood that looked dead, that beneath the char there were still living cells waiting for their moment. The fox emerged from winter leaner but intact, his red coat shed and regrown, his body carrying the memory of hunger but not its current reality. The forest was exploding with prey, rabbits proliferating in the new growth, voles drunk on spring abundance, birds returning to nest in the recovering landscape. After the scarcity of winter, the plenty felt almost obscene, and the fox hunted with the efficiency of someone who remembered what it meant to be hungry and refused to forget. The wolf pack, too, had survived. The alpha pair's pups from the previous year were nearly adults now, their bodies filling out with muscle and capability, learning the complex social dynamics that would determine their eventual place in the hierarchy or drive them to leave and find their own territories. The injured adolescent's limp had become permanent, but he'd found his role, staying near the den, helping to watch the new pups that the alpha female had birthed in late March, contributing to the pack's survival in ways that didn't require perfect legs. The fox still visited the boundary stone, though less frequently now that survival didn't demand constant effort. The exchanges had become less about necessity and more about acknowledgement. A rabbit left here, a portion of venison there, the ongoing conversation between two species that had found a language despite having no words in common. In early May, on a morning when the air smelled of pine pollen and new grass and the particular sweetness of a world remembering itself, the fox approached the boundary stone to find the alpha male waiting. It was the first time they'd been this close since the winter night when the big wolf had closed the distance between them at this same spot. The fox stopped, every muscle ready for flight, but something in the alpha male's posture spoke of intention rather than threat. The wolf was not alone. Beside him sat one of the new pups, barely 2 months old, all oversized paws and uncertain coordination, her coat still carrying the blue-gray tint of extreme youth. The pup looked at the fox with eyes that held no fear, only curiosity, seeing not prey but simply another creature in the forest, another shape moving through the world. The alpha male made a low sound, and the pup tilted her head. The big wolf was teaching her, the fox realized, showing her that the world was more complex than the simple categories of prey and predator, that survival sometimes meant making alliances that made no sense,
that the forest held mysteries deeper than hunger and fear. The pup took a tentative step toward the fox, and the alpha male led her, his body language permissive. The fox held very still as the young wolf approached, her nose working the air, trying to understand him through scent and sight. She got within 10 feet before her natural caution kicked in, and she retreated back to the safety of her father's shadow. The alpha male touched his muzzle to the pup's head in approval, then looked at the fox with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been something else. Perhaps the understanding that what they'd created together was being passed forward, that the impossibility of their relationship would become part of the pack's knowledge, would shape how these young wolves saw the world and their place in it.
Then the wolf and the pup were gone, moving back toward the den with the easy efficiency of those who belonged completely to their place and their pack. The fox stood at the boundary stone long after they disappeared, feeling something shift in his chest. Not grief, not exactly, but a kind of bittersweet recognition that the story they'd been writing together had reached a natural point of completion. The debt, whatever it had been, was not just paid, but transformed into something stranger and more durable: legacy. The young wolves would grow up knowing that a fox had saved their pack twice, once from fire, once from winter, and that knowledge would change them in ways too subtle to measure, but too significant to ignore. Over the following weeks, the fox began to range farther from the wolf territory, exploring the recovering forest, re-establishing the patterns of solitary life that were natural to his kind. He found a den site near the eastern edge of the burned area, where the forest was returning with particular vigor, the new growth so thick it provided cover that the old forest had never offered. He marked the territory, established his hunting routes, began the work of being simply a fox again, not a messenger, not a provider, not a witness to impossible alliances, but just a small red hunter moving through the green world, taking what he needed and caching what he didn't, existing in the present tense without the weight of the past or the complexity of debts owed and paid. But he never quite stopped visiting the boundary stone. Once a week, sometimes less, he would travel back to the territory he'd shared with the wolves, leaving a token, a rabbit, a grouse, sometimes just his scent, and finding, more often than not, that something had been left in return. The exchanges became ritual rather than necessity, a conversation that continued not because either party needed it, but because some things, once begun, gained their own momentum, their own reason for being. In late June, on a morning heavy with dew and the drowsy hum of insects, the fox made his weekly visit to the boundary stone and found something different. Not food, but a single wolf pup. The same female the alpha male had brought months before, now larger and more confident, but still carrying that openness that very young animals have before the world teaches them caution. She was alone, which should have been impossible. Wolves didn't leave pups unsupervised, especially not at boundary edges where danger from other predators was highest. But there she was, sitting at the stone like she'd been waiting, her amber eyes tracking the fox's approach with interest rather than fear. The fox stopped, confused and wary. He scented the air for the adult wolves who must be nearby, supervising, but found nothing. The pup was truly alone, or as alone as a wolf pup could be while still within howling distance of the pack. She made a small sound, not quite a bark, not quite a whine, and took a step toward him. The fox retreated an equal distance, maintaining the boundary that safety demanded. The pup stopped, sat down, tilted her head in that universal gesture of canine curiosity. They regarded each other across 10 feet of spring grass, two young animals at the beginning of their stories, inheritors of an alliance they hadn't created, but would carry forward in ways neither could predict. The pup didn't try to close the distance again, respecting some lesson she'd been taught about boundaries and respect and the space that different species required to feel safe. After a long moment, she stood, gave the fox one last look that seemed to say she understood more than a pup should, and trotted back toward the den complex, her oversized paws finding purchase on the earth with growing confidence. The fox watched her go, and in his chest something settled, the final piece of grief for his lost mate and kits finding its place among the other things he carried. He would never forget them, never stop feeling the absence, but the absence had been joined by something else, the knowledge that loss was not the end of the story, that from tragedy could come connection, that the forest was always writing new narratives on top of old scars. He left a fat rabbit at the boundary stone, his finest catch of the day, and returned to his own territory as the sun climbed toward noon, painting the recovering forest in shades of green and gold and the infinite variations of light that spoke of summer arriving, of warmth returning, of the world continuing its patient work of renewal. The seasons turned. The forest completed its recovery, the burned timber becoming habitat for woodpeckers and owls, the new growth providing cover and food for prey species, the entire ecosystem reorganizing itself around the changes the fire had made. The wolf pack thrived, the young wolves from that spring growing into their roles, some staying with the pack, others leaving to find their own territories and mates. And the fox lived his fox life, hunting, denning, ranging across his territory with the efficient solitude that was his birthright. But once a week, sometimes more in winter, sometimes less in the easy months of summer, he visited the boundary stone, leaving his offerings, finding responses, maintaining the strange conversation that had no precedent and no parallel, but was, nonetheless, real. Years later, when the fox was old, and the alpha male who had left food at his den that first morning was himself old, replaced in the pack's leadership by one of the pups who had been taught that a fox could be trusted, they met one final time at the boundary stone. Both moved with the careful stiffness of animals whose bodies had carried them through more seasons than most of their kind saw. They sat on opposite sides of the stone, not close, but closer than prey and predator should ever sit. And they watched the sunrise together in a silence that held everything they'd never been able to say: gratitude and respect, and the acknowledgement that they had changed each other, had made each other larger than their species demanded, had found in the crucible of crisis something that transcended the simple stories of survival. When the sun had fully risen, the old wolf stood with effort and touched his nose to the stone, the first and only time he'd ever crossed that boundary without invitation or emergency. Then he turned and walked back toward his territory with the dignity of a creature who had lived well and fully, who had nothing left to prove. The fox watched him go, then stood himself, his movements just as careful, just as deliberate. He touched his own nose to the same spot the wolf had touched, tasting the scent of old allies, old mysteries, old promises kept. Then he too turned away, heading back to his den one final time, carrying with him the knowledge that the forest was vast and wild and indifferent. But sometimes, in the small spaces between predator and prey, between solitude and pack, between instinct and choice, there was room for something else, something that had no name but existed nonetheless, written in the language of boundaries respected, and gifts exchanged, and warnings given when silence would have been easier. The boundary stone remains, marking the place where impossible things happened and continued to happen, where the rigid laws of nature bent just enough to allow for mercy and choice, and the recognition that survival was sometimes about more than teeth and speed. It was about knowing when to cross the line, when to warn the enemy, when to feed those who had taken everything, when to stay when leaving was safer. The forest knows.
The stones remember, and somewhere in the green depths where foxes still hunt and wolves still run, the story continues, passed from generation to generation, changing in the telling, but always carrying at its heart the same truth. That the world is larger than our fears, that kindness can coexist with wildness, and that sometimes the most impossible things are also the most necessary.